say good morning, ladies and gentlemen, but we only have photographer gentlemen here. So good morning, ladies. It's going to be nice to have this conversation with you this morning. You came, I guess, because of the title. I assume that you're interested in this topic, perhaps have delved into this topic a little bit, have thought about this topic. Could I just have a sampling of the audience? How many of you have actually explicitly taught intercultural communication or intercultural competence to your students? How many of you have developed a unit or integrated it into your other units? Yes, me. In what way? Could you mention? It was part of your syllabus?
Yes, that is about culture, about readings from different cultures and how practices are different. So students learn English through being exposed to
Very good. You've already got one step into the fields, right? Yes?
Yes, I think most syllables have the same thing. In many units, your students are exposed to different types of cultures through maybe customs, maybe the kinds of food, maybe behaviors, and so on. So I think many students, especially in international schools or experimental schools, are exposed to such things.
And you're saying in your syllabus, more is it target culture? That's what we're going to get into. English, let's say English native speaking countries, of course they're multicultural themselves, but English country cultures or diverse cultures from, say, Asia, diverse cultures. Okay, well I know that the textbooks are evolving these days because intercultural competence or intercultural communication is one of the new bywords. The people who just arrived, would you take a handout, maybe from up here? Okay, that handout, by the way, is a poem. We're not going to read it, but I just wanted to offer this to you as a kind of setting the scene, setting the tone. It's we and they. If you want to maybe just, well, I'll just read the first stanza maybe. Father, mother, and me, sister and auntie say, all the people like us are we, and everyone else is they. And they live over the sea, while we live over the way. But would you believe it? They look upon we as only a sort of they. And it's a very nice poem, and it kind of embodies the whole message of this session. So I'll leave it to you to read the rest of the poem. But who is we? Who is they? We are us. Okay, so in this short presentation, we're not going to have time to go into everything, but we'll attempt to have, first of all, a definition of what is culture. Now, as you know, this is a hotly debated topic, but one of the ways to define it is culture as an artifact. You're talking about artifacts of culture. These can be artistic artifacts, they can be daily use artifacts, the type of pots and pans people use, the clothing people wear. These are all artifacts of culture, and of course that's one way to define culture. But there are many other ways to define culture. One is as a set of practices. All right, so what does that mean, a set of practices? Can anyone think of an example? What would be a set of practices, cultural practices? Can somebody give an example? Yes?
I think it's like the traditions and customs that each country has to deal with.
What you do when a baby is born. Do you have a sabaiya? Do you have a miaiya? Do you have a 1 year thing? Those kinds of, how do you behave? What are the rituals at weddings? What are the rituals at particular holidays for that culture? So a set of practices. These are obvious. What other kinds of practices could be included in a definition of culture? Or what other practices constitute culture, I should say, besides rituals and things of that sort? Other practices that are cultural. We're moving a bit into the next point, but anyone, did I hear a contribution over here? Sorry.
Festivals?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Festivals?
Festivals, well that's what I think, beyond the festivals and the rituals, what other kinds of practices compose culture? Yes?
a time.
Time.
If you come at the very start or if you come
10 minutes late is totally acceptable. Also, if the speaker is speaking and you just walk out or in and out, if that's acceptable.
Or you speak while the speaker is speaking.
or the phone.
Yes.
Maybe somebody's rules.
Can you speak up a little louder?
Somebody's rules.
Values and rules, right. Rules for interaction, rules for arriving. It's fashionably late, or it's impolite to be even 2 minutes late, right? So, things like that. Now, looking at the third item there, culture as meaning making. How concepts are defined, when they're defined, why they're defined, who defines them. All right. So culture as meaning making. How concepts are defined. So what even defines a particular ritual? You just say, oh, these people are just having breakfast. But there may be certain things that compose having breakfast. And if it's not there, it's not breakfast. I used to live in Korea before I came here to Egypt. And if you give people like toast or cornflakes or orange juice or whatever you might give them for breakfast, I mean, I would call it breakfast. Koreans don't call it breakfast because there's no rice and there's no kimchi. Even for breakfast, they want to have their kimchi. Now, of course, there are people who don't do the traditional Korean breakfast, but the definition of a breakfast has to have bap, the rice. And without rice, you haven't had a meal. So there's certain things that go into the composition of culture, and it's a concept, as you were saying. It's values, it's a conceptualization of what constitutes a breakfast, what constitutes saying good night even, something as simple as good night. Does it involve kissing people on the cheek? Does it involve going all around the room, all around the house, kissing everybody good night? Or is it just, hey guys, I'm going to bed, and that's it? You know, in some cultures that might be perceived very impolitely, and in other cultures, the kissing everybody in the room is like, do we have to go through this? Right? So how are these concepts defined? What would you say? How are they defined? My point here is that the concepts are, of course, they're transmitted. They're transmitted by parents, by your socialization, whether it's in a family context or in a social context. But how does culture change? I'm sure all of you would agree that you'll say the youth are doing things differently these days. The youth interacts with their parents differently since the revolution, I keep hearing. Things are changing, so who changes it? Who are the agents of change? And what's changing? Yes?
I think because nowadays the world is open, so there are many channels through which you can see other countries. Maybe in the past, every country has its own rules and behaviors, and they were not open to the other world countries. But maybe nowadays, because we can see, we watch many foreign films, we meet each other. Sometimes some concepts and cultures are transmitted that way.
That's the interesting point. Sometimes when we are confronted with a different model or a different pattern or a different conceptualization, we react by rejecting it. Sometimes we react by accepting it. And I think that's the crux of the problem. As teachers, if we present a model or expose, let's say expose our students to different cultural practices, are they going to accept it? Are they going to recognize it as a different cultural practice? Are they going to tolerate it? Are they going to allow that, oh, this is a possibility of a different way of looking at things? Are they perhaps going to interiorize it, adopt it, take it on board for themselves? You know, we have to think about what stage we want in intercultural communication, intercultural competence. We have to think about what stage we want to bring our students to. And in general, when we're teaching English, particularly in a situation where you're teaching, we're not in the United States, we don't want the students to adapt and become adapted to American life or adapted to British life. You probably here in a context like this, you want people not only to adapt, I shouldn't say adapt, you want people to tolerate and recognize difference. You know, we are us. They may do it differently, but we still have that human interaction. So you had something you wanted to say there?
Yes.
Yes.
Especially those days, you know, Korean films and Korean actors and One Direction band and so on. Young students used to adapt or to adopt
They love the actor or it looks cool.
Yes.
Right.
So, because I saw something like this in my students, so because they are so attached to the Korean films and series, so they know many things about Korean culture and so on. So it happens all the time.
I see. So that's a very nice point. So there's some kind of affective, emotional connection.
Yes.
As we know, usually when you have a personal friend or you've been personally touched by something, you're more open to it. You're
You want to
looser.
know everything about their life.
So that is also part of the key of how we can lead our students into intercultural communication. All right. Now, another question is lingua culture. You probably have heard this term. Lingua culture. The language is a repository of culture. Of course, the culture is expressed, the values are expressed through language, but also at the same time, language is the tool by which culture is created. By using new terms, by introducing new ways of speaking, by even opening up certain topics. This is the gateway or the window into cultural exposure. So our language classrooms, of course, are the primary places where this can happen. Not to say that other classes, other subject teachers, whether it be mathematicians or history or social studies, not to say that they're not also within their fields contributing, hopefully, to intercultural communication or intercultural competence these days. But usually the burden is placed on the language teachers to shape their students and make them ready for this intercultural communication. I have a quote here related to that from, this is not Edward T. Hall, this is Joan Kelly Hall. Because culture is located in activity, any study of language is by necessity a study of culture. So we don't need to rehash, I think, whether our language classrooms are a venue for study of culture. I think that's a given. But what I want to talk about, I'm just going to jump ahead to show you what I want to talk about is this. I'm going to go back. Basically what I'm moving up to is this. Whether we teach English as an L2 and it's C2, culture 2, the culture of, if we can even define them, the English-speaking cultures, if you can say such a thing. Those speakers this morning have made the point that there is no longer an English culture or an American culture. Or, on the other hand, do we teach the L2, English and intercultural competence? Intercultural communication, intercultural competence. So that's what I'm moving up to, but before we get there, what is exactly, well, not exactly, there are many definitions, but I've put forth a few suggestions of what we could define as intercultural competence. A knowledge of an array of specific cultural differences. Obviously, it's impossible to be exhaustive, to know every cultural difference in every culture in every country, or even within our own cultures. If you take a group of 3 friends, they're each going to have their own family culture, and sometimes the family cultures are very different from one family to another within the same building, or neighborhood, or country. But part of intercultural competence is to be aware that there are profound cultural differences. So knowledge of a selection or an array of cultural differences. Another component of intercultural competence, as I see it, is the realization and acceptance that other cultures follow different rules, have different values, have different models of what is right. And that's one of the sticklers, right? We say, well, that's a funny way of doing things. That's not really whatever. That's not a real this or a real that. But the realization that others have a right way and an acceptance that other cultures have a right way. This is all just mental. We're not even into the action yet. This is still in the mental state. Moving a bit more into active involvement in intercultural competence, something I call self-monitoring and checking of self-centeredness. I didn't get this from a book. I kind of came up with this, this way of phrasing it myself. I don't know if you like that. I call it self-centeredness, which is what we are. We're all individuals, and our way of looking at the world, the way of looking at values emanates from ourselves, from all the things that made us who we are. And it seems to me, and I would just like to ask you if you agree, that being able to self-monitor and check yourself, am I being ethnocentric? Am I being judgmental? And to do that, I actively do that. I try to do it. Probably I don't do it enough. Sometimes in my classes I probably project Americanism, or I can ask some of my students who are in the audience here. But I do try to check. I may not always be successful at it, but I try to check myself. Am I making a value judgment based on some cultural concept rather than a teacherly, pedagogic, and objective decision? And I try to engage in that self-monitoring and checking my self-centeredness a lot, not to say that I'm always successful. Would you agree that that's part of moving along the continuum of becoming interculturally competent? Also, I think you have to have a tolerance for ambiguity. It needs to be well developed. What is a tolerance for ambiguity? Would anybody care to contribute a definition? Sorry, over there? Mystery? Mystery, okay. Ambiguity is like a mystery, yeah. Way in the back?
We don't have to ask about the details of the specific definition of something. So we have sometimes to accept it the way it is. Like, okay, yeah.
Like, I'm not sure what's going on here. Let me see how this is going to play out.
Yes.
Or, I felt insulted, but I don't think this person was very smiling and very friendly. I don't think this person intended to insult me. Something else must be going on here. I have thank you, that's good. I have a little anecdote that I've told to some of my students sometimes. I used to live in Hawaii, and I was teaching English to a group of bankers from Korea. It was the last weekend before they were all going home, and they needed to buy gifts for their wives back in Korea. So I offered to drive a couple of them around in my car to go to places to buy souvenirs for their wives. And so I had my own car, and I picked up the first guy, and he says, you know, good morning, have you had breakfast? And I said, actually, no, I was running late. And then expected that he would say, oh, well, let's stop at McDonald's, or let's stop somewhere and get you something to eat. And he says, he didn't say anything. He just said, have you had breakfast? I said, no, actually, I haven't. I'm hungry, I was implying. And then we just went along, drove, and picked up the other guy. Have you had breakfast? No, I haven't. And this is a Korean thing to just say, have you had breakfast? And I didn't really, I was new in Korean culture. I hadn't been to Korea. I was in Hawaii interacting with Koreans. And I felt like, gosh, they just asked me if I've had breakfast, and I said no, and they didn't even offer to, you know, stop and grab a bite, even at McDonald's. And I misinterpreted this. And then the same day, the same two guys that I was driving around town, one of them said, oh, you know, I've been here in Hawaii for 2 months. I haven't had a chance to drive. Do you think I could drive your car? So I said, okay, you have a driver's license? And he said, yeah. Okay, so these guys. So I let this guy drive my car, and we came out of a restaurant, and the guy who's going to drive the car sits at the wheel, and I planned, because he's like new driver in Hawaii, I was going to sit beside him in the passenger seat. And then the other guy said, no, teacher, you know, they called me teacher, you sit in the back. And I said, you know, and I felt insulted. I said, in the back, it's my car. He doesn't know how to drive. I need to give him instructions. Well, why are they putting me in the back? And they said, no. And they were being very polite about it. And I said, and I felt a little bit put off. Well, I didn't understand. That day I just felt a little grumpy, and I just let it go. And I would say, you got to get in the left lane. You got to turn on your left signal. I was going to give him, you know, what do you call backseat driver things. But I felt a little bit out of sorts. Later, I learned, a few months later, I learned from Koreans that the back rear seat is the honored place. And so they were trying to honor me as teacher, even though it was my car and it was, you know, I was responsible for what was going to happen on the road. So things like that. This is a kind of tolerance for ambiguity. I wasn't very tolerant. I actually felt a little bit upset. But that's the kind of thing, through these experiences, you gain this tolerance for ambiguity. And so now I'm much less judgmental when I feel, it may feel insulting or it feels a little bit off in terms of my culture. Yes?
Yeah, I have something interesting about this. When you are in Saudi, it's completely the opposite. Because one day my friend was driving me in Saudi, and I opened the front seat, like I want to sit in the front seat. Because, you know, if I sit in the back, that is my driver and the VIP.
Yeah, right.
But he said, no, please sit at the back. Why? Because, you know, we might be like, go to jail for that because I'm not his wife.
Right,
so,
right. You see, this is in Saudi Arabia.
Opposite, yes.
Right. Exactly. I've lived in Saudi Arabia and I know the story. That's right. Okay, well, so tolerance of ambiguity, tolerance of difference is another characteristic of interculturally competent people, and I would say even sometimes celebration of difference. It's hard to get to that stage, but I think it's one of the goals. And finally, here on this list, this is not an exhaustive list, but another item, an ability, this is the linguistic part, an ability to assess and adjust your spoken language to the partner's linguistic and cultural level. And I think, of course, as teachers, we try to do that all the time, but I'm not talking about us as teachers right now, I'm just talking about us as interculturally competent people and what we want to move our students into. To be able to adjust your language, if you find somebody who's speaking broken or very hesitant English or Arabic or French or whatever language it may be, you don't have to throw out, your high-level teacher talk or your high-level native speaker or near-native speaker language at them. You need to adjust it to their level and also to their cultural experience level. Right. So, what is the dilemma in ELT, in language teaching? I feel, this is a discussable point, but what I feel is that teachers of other foreign languages, other than English, Arabs teaching Arabic as a foreign language, Egyptians teaching French as a foreign language, any language other than English that is the target language, target second language, I think that they don't have such a crucial dilemma that we as English teachers have, because of English being the lingua franca. In other cultures, if you're teaching French or if you're teaching Arabic to non-native speakers, you can say this is Arab culture and it's appropriate. It's very appropriate, I think, to impart knowledge of cultural norms in that target language culture. I think that we as English teachers have a much bigger problem, because as the statistics say, there are more non-native speakers of English than there are native speakers, and it's more highly likely that the people who are learning English in Egypt or any other country are going to be interacting with other non-native English speakers. So it's not so much about knowing let's call it the English-speaking cultures, even though we realize there's not one, but the English-speaking cultures, the American, the British, the Canadian, whatever. So it seems to me that it behooves us, it's more important for us than any other kind of language teacher to impart intercultural communication using English as a lingua franca. Would you agree? How does that sit with you? Is that, or do you not agree? Somebody shaking their head over there. I'm saying, just you agree with these two statements, that teachers of other foreign languages, it's more appropriate and more accepted and more acceptable to teach their target culture, along with the target language. Whereas for English, sorry?
If the teacher is well aware of the target culture, because some teachers are not.
Well, let's assume they are, but I'm just saying that the dilemma is for us, for English teachers. I think that we have a heavier burden of teaching intercultural communication, intercultural competence, than teachers of other languages, because people who are teaching Arabic are probably preparing their students to speak with Arabs. People who are teaching French are preparing them to speak with people who speak French, although French is also, and Arabic too, to some degree. French is a well-known international language. But English is really the international language at this point, at least for the next 10 or 20 years until Chinese takes over. Right. So English, being the lingua franca of the world, I believe creates a special status for us as teachers of English in the intercultural communication teaching. And so my question to you, I put question marks at the bottom, is it or should it be the English teacher's role to prepare our students for using English as a lingua franca and to be interculturally competent? I mean, you see, there are serious arguments. They've done surveys, in my readings in preparation for this and in the readings for the class that I taught last semester on intercultural communication. There's surveys, and in some places it is absolutely not necessarily an accepted thing that we need to teach English for intercultural communication. I'm a language teacher, I'm just going to teach them the language. I don't need to worry about the culture. It'll kind of come along with itself. There will be a few readings in our textbook. They will absorb it by osmosis, and then what they do with English outside my classroom, that's another story, and it's not part of my duty, let's say. Any comments on that? right, which accents. In some countries, for example, in Germany, students enroll in the American track or the British track, and they're not supposed to say, you're not supposed to write the OUR if they're in the American track. They can write either one, but they have to do each one systematically. They have to speak with that accent during their exams. I think Germany, to my knowledge, Germany is the only country that has it divided so strictly. But, sorry? Yes?
Actually, I do think that the issue has a more political aspect because of the political, like the colonial relationship that we had previously with the English, and probably now America is the most power. I have nothing against these powers anyway, but the point is, I think that it has an aspect that we feel sensitive about talking against or talking even for. So if we are going to teach the culture, the American culture positively, we'll probably be accused of being pro-American and we're trying to change the students. But French is a distant other. It's still an other, but to us, there is some sort
Except in post-colonial Africa.
I guess so. Because we don't have that problem with the Germans, so that we think that the Germans know they are different. So, and the French, they are different.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. This is my personal opinion.
That's right. That's right. There is also the political alliance.